Good day, queens and kings. We are in the month of November 2020 when this is being recorded, so people are thinking about two things: the election and our fucked up families. Which means it is the perfect time to talk about Leviathan. Leviathan is a 2014 Russian language drama film directed by Andrei Zvyagintsev. Can't believe I nailed that on the first try. This movie is available for free on YouTube. Oddly enough, you can also buy it on YouTube, but there's a full-length subtitled version that's been up for free for over 4 years, so I'm pretty certain it'll still be there by the time you check it out. And I should say this version isn't a bootleg version or anything. It has all the official titles and it's full high definition with a good translation. Leviathan is an immensely understated film primarily about family and the corruption of power. It is one of the most harrowing films I've ever seen, not because any of the events are particularly horrific, but more so because the very dull depiction of unfathomable misfortune. I've changed things up a bit here, but format is still mostly the same. I'll be talking about 4 things in this video. If you're watching on YouTube, you should see this video is divided into segments. Feel free to skip around. I assume you've either decided to watch this film based on my recommendation alone, or you're okay with spoiling it for yourself, so be warned, there's going to be a lot of those spoilers in this video. I'll give a brief premise of the film, then I want to talk about its neorealism depiction of Russian life, then I'll talk about the abject misery of all the characters. Specifically, I want to look at one character named Lilya, and finally I want to talk about the themes of statism and religion. Leviathan has a lot of characters, but it primarily follows the story of Kolya, a widower who lives in the northern tundra of Russia near the Finnish border. Kolya leads a relatively mundane life as a mechanic and general odd-job handyman, but his lifestyle is at risk due to the local town attempting to seize his property to build some unknown structure. Early on in the film, we get a pretty blatant exposition of his legal dispute with the town, indicating Kolya has attempted to fight the seizure through the court system, but it's been pretty resoundingly rebuffed by the courts in what is depicted as an obvious case of local corruption. However, Kolya has help from his childhood friend Dmitry, a lawyer from Moscow, who has traveled north to help him out. In addition to Kolya, the other characters of note are his girlfriend Lilya, his son Roma, his girlfriend's friends Angela and Pasha, and of course the antagonist of the story, Mayor Vadim. I should mention up front that Leviathan was not just inspired by true events, but literally based on a true story. In 2004, there was an American man in Granby, Colorado named Marvin Heemeyer who claimed he had been swindled by the local town zoning board in a variety of ways. Before you go looking up that guy in Google, I can tell you how his story relates to the movie and how it relates to the things I want to talk about. So number one, Heemeyer became so incensed by his problems with the town that he built what is now referred to as a killdozer, a bulldozer modified with armor plating and 3 ports for mounted guns, including a 50 caliber rifle. Heemeyer used the killdozer to demolish 13 different properties that were either part of his dispute with the zoning board or owned by local establishments that refused to help him, such as the local newspaper office. Miraculously, Heemeyer did not kill anyone during his rampage, but that seems purely coincidental. I'm mentioning the details of his story because it's worth noting the events in Leviathan are not so detached from reality that they could never happen. That being said, the more true version of this story doesn't usually have the level of bombast that Heemeyer's does. The second thing I want to say before you go Googling this guy and get added to the list that I am now on, you should know Heemeyer is now considered a martyr by fringe conservatives as well as far-right accelerationists. Tea Party conservatives see Heemeyer as the natural response to a corrupt government and the overuse of eminent domain, even though there was no eminent domain in his specific case. Meanwhile, right-wing accelerationists known as the Boogaloo Boys have taken a line from Heemeyer's personal diary as a rallying cry for their cause. Heemeyer wrote before his rampage that, quote, "Sometimes reasonable men must do unreasonable things. This is now shorthanded as, quote, I became unreasonable," and that's used as an explanation for wanton political violence. The third and last thing to know is that none of this happens in the movie. However, However, stories like what happens in Leviathan are often used as a way to give more radical ideas a foothold before bursting open the door with a bunch of crazy shit. So I want to be explicit and say these radical views on eminent domain or accelerationism, they really have no contact with reality. In fact, I'd say they are toxic manifestations of you can't tell me what to do individualism or nothing matters so blow it all up nihilism. And it's important to rebuff these because Leviathan is not a representation of either of those ideas, but rather it is a depiction of the desperate struggle to protect what we think is important in our ordinary lives as we find ourselves wading further and further into the depths of hell. One thing I love about this movie, and it may be what you hate about this movie, is its neorealist depiction of the world and its characters. By neorealism, I am referring to the 1940s film movement known as Italian neorealism. This era of filmmaking was known for its raw depiction of post-World War II Italy and was characterized by an inescapable portrayal of the time it existed within. So what that means is just that it was a simple fact that Italy was devastated by poverty, oppression, and a growing lower class that was turning on one another as their lives became more desperate after the war. While the films in this era often wrote these themes into their stories, the movement was notable because any film made during this era was submerged in the reality of Italy at that time. In a way, movies like The Bicycle Thief or Rome Open City have become a type of historical tourism for a time period that no longer exists. Any random shot in that movie has that Italy in its background, whether it wanted to or not. Leviathan is a modern film depicting modern Russia, but it shares this common feeling that you are touring a historical place and time for a specific part of the world. By experiencing the relative mundane existence of these characters, you are gaining insight into what their lives are like in this world. This is the result of creative decisions that focus on portraying the realism of Leviathan's world. We are brought into that world through a montage of still shots that act as the film's opening. This is such an easy way to begin a movie, but I think it's really worthwhile in this instance because for many people, the northern Russian tundra might as well be another planet. Since this region is so far north and the film is set so close to winter, we see this as a naturally dark environment that's defined by long stretches of nothingness. What little civilization exists in this part of the world looks dilapidated or abandoned. This montage of shots is accompanied by a pretty moving orchestral score, and it's worth pointing out that this is only one of two instances of non-diegetic sound in the entire movie, the other being at the very end with another montage of still shots. These montages are really the only artsy cinematography in the whole movie, if you can even call it that. All of the filmmaking is practical, classical editing. We're either looking at whichever character is talking, or more commonly, we're in a wider shot that encompasses every relevant element of the scene without requiring much editing at all. I think this is an intentional decision that prevents the viewer from getting distracted with reminders that this is a work of fiction. If it had dramatic close-ups or more attempts at symbolism, it might prevent us from connecting with the reality of this world and its lifelike characters. The connection to these characters is not explicitly formed, but rather an understated osmosis that comes from naturally experiencing their environment. There's a trope in Hollywood filmmaking that so-called ordinary people somehow live in these lavish million-dollar apartments in New York City. And if you're primarily exposed to American filmmaking, you may be shocked at some of the smaller details of Kolya's life that reinforces the level of poverty he is living in. For example, despite owning property, which is typically a sign of economic status, Kolya's life lacks any glamour whatsoever. He works as an odd-job contractor, and pretty much everything in his house looks homemade, including tables, counters, and chairs. He also doesn't appear to have any working plumbing. His bathroom is an outhouse that he has to walk to, even in the freezing temperatures that are so common up north. He doesn't even have a working faucet, but rather a pitcher with a tap to wash your hands. It also goes without saying that what the family eats is reflective of their environment. The most posh food item is a cherry tomato that we see briefly, but the vast majority of their food intake is straight vodka. The constant drinking in this movie was actually a point of criticism in its reception, specifically from Russia's Minister of Culture, Vladimir Medinsky. Leviathan was actually partly funded by Russia's Ministry of Culture to promote Russian artists, but Medinsky took issue with the depiction of every single character being drunk for the majority of the film. While this depiction is obviously unflattering if you're trying to promote Russia, Russian viewers have commended the film for its honesty. The majority of the 7,000 comments on the YouTube video I referenced earlier are all Russian Russian speakers, echoing the high praise for the film's accuracy and its relatability. All of this is to say the neorealist depiction is successful at grounding the film in reality, enough that Russian viewers actually identify it as the country they are from. This becomes very much needed to make the events of the film believable. If this film had been more cinematic in its presentation, it might have been unfairly written off as an exaggeration or unrealistic, but its commitment to this understated depiction is what makes so much of the event so disturbing. In some of the more climactic and unbelievably cruel moments of the story, there is a persistent decision to take away from the excitement inherent in these scenes by portraying them with this dull sense of insignificance. You never feel like you're experiencing the climax of a conflict. Everything has the gravitas of an afternoon errand. I think of one scene in the second half of the film where a character's life is being threatened, but it's shown from the interior of a car driven by hired muscle. From this perspective, we're not the character whose life is at stake, but instead a bored employee listening to the radio, just waiting for his boss to tell him what to do. It's these creative decisions that make the film feel so unique, because despite countless stories out there similar to Leviathan, this is one that feels real. The believability of the story makes it easier to empathize with the characters and their lives, which appear to be defined by abject misery. The beginning of this film establishes Kolya and Dmitri have a lasting and intimate friendship, but beyond that, there is rarely a moment of levity or optimism in this entire movie. Every character's relationship with one another is either brimming with resentment or the result of coercion. Kolya says he feels pressured to do work for local police officers who pretend they have this type of friendship. Lilya has a tense relationship with Kolya's son, Roma. Actually, Roma is kind of a problem child for everybody in the family. And even Dmitri and Kolya, who have this friendship, is plagued by Dmitri's concern of Kolya's hot-headedness and how it may impact the case that they're working on. Lilya's friends appear to have a more light-hearted relationship, but even this relationship has stoic coldness and irony that defines emotionally distant lovers and the Slavic people in general. This pervasive misery is no less true for the antagonist of the film. Despite being a person in a position of power, Mayor Vadim appears to be just as much in the throes of alcohol abuse and paranoia as the people he's terrorizing. Vadim constantly seeks reassurance from a religious advisor, and he repeatedly berates his own staff out of concern of corruption allegations that might impact his election a year from now. And I should say, for anyone unfamiliar with local level politicians, the stereotype and portrayal of an unimportant person terrified that they won't win re-election to an unremarkable position of power is incredibly accurate. And I know some people are going to respond to this part of the video by asking, Arthur, why would I subject myself to a movie that's going to make me feel horrible? And to that, I would say nothing about this movie feels unfairly negative. I think there's a difference between depicting a difficult reality and indulging in a despair narrative. This isn't a movie that's out to hurt your feelings. It's one that wants you to empathize with its characters. Granted, these are characters who live difficult lives facing a difficult situation, and they're just as flawed as the heroic protagonists we see in other movies, but more importantly, these people are real. Maybe Kolya and Lilya do not literally exist, but their story is no less true. And with that in mind, I don't see this movie as overtly pessimistic, but rather one attempting to illuminate the humanity of people who are often ignored in favor of stories with more grandeur. With that in mind, a lot of the struggles of these characters are almost laughably mundane. These are people who can have their entire life upended and destroyed because of matters so trivial. It'd almost be funny if it weren't for the kernel of truth that this is often how things go in small towns. Early on in the film, you can feel the tension Kolya has declining work requests from local police officers because he knows they can and will give him a hard time if he doesn't navigate the conversation correctly. Much of Kolya's problems begin when a drunk Mayor Vadim shows up to Kolya's household and accosts him. This motivates Dmitri to file an official complaint, but when they go to file the complaint the next day, Kolya gets frustrated with the office clerk and he ends up in prison. This is a nightmarish alternative reality to dealing with customer support, except the automated phone line has the power to throw you in jail. It's difficult to express how oppressive it is to live under these circumstances. It's easy to view Kolya as just an idiotic hothead from the perspective of our lives in relative comfort. But Kolya is a person who is incapable of escaping the stress of his current moment, and as a result, he is at the whims of his predestined biological impulses. In fact, when we see the characters attempt to have a relaxing day off roughly halfway through this movie, we get a clear indication of the depth of their depression. Kolya and company are invited to celebrate a local police officer's birthday, and their method of relaxation is to drink a metric fuck-ton of alcohol while shooting guns at portraits of previous Russian leaders. I think this recreational activity is pretty blatantly sad, but if it needs to be said, there's something tragic about enjoying life by blacking out and living a power fantasy that you have control over the people who've created the life you now live. This scene of the cast shooting guns is meant to be a moment of peace before the storm, but given its dreary dullness, it mostly reinforces the sadness of their lives, which can explain why these characters are so flawed. During the birthday party, Kolya discovers Lilya has been having an affair with Dmitri. Kolya attacks both of them, but the encounter occurs off-screen, and we only see what happens after they get back from the birthday party. From this point in the movie onwards, there are a lot of criticisms that can be laid on pretty much every single character, but I want to focus specifically on Lilya because she is perhaps the least sympathetic, which is not to say I think people should not sympathize with her. Before we talk about the decisions Lilya makes, it's important to truly acknowledge her circumstance and try to understand what her life is like. Lilya is a woman who grew up in this isolated hellhole of a town, which means she's lived under these dire circumstances her entire life. She's in a relationship with a man who has an obvious temper problem and apparently has a willingness to hit women. This man's son actively despises her, and Kolya doesn't do a lot to defend her. On top of that, Lilya works long hours at a fish factory where she has the monotonous task of cutting bones out of fish to ship them to grocery stores. This is the type of environment where people need support from one another just to survive the mundane terror of existence, but Lilya doesn't get that in her current situation. If we truly empathize with Lilya's circumstance and acknowledge no person would ever want to live a life like the one she has if they had a choice, we can understand her decisions more clearly. Her affair with Dmitri isn't a sexual fling driven by desire, but rather an understandable attempt to preserve her life by escaping her circumstance. Dmitri represents an opportunity to move away from this corrupt and awful town. He represents a partner who respects her and doesn't abuse her physically or neglect her emotionally. He represents a better life, and her affair is an attempt to acquire that life. But for reasons that are not clear, Dmitri asks if Lilya will join him in Moscow only to push her away. Later, when Angela asks about going to Moscow, Lilya doesn't respond. We don't know what happens specifically, but it becomes obvious Dmitri has left while Lilya has stayed. With no other option available, Lilya is forced to reconcile with Kolya. To give an indication of how flattering of an idea this is, the reconciliation occurs by Kolya raping Lilya. This is distressing enough on its own, but the more disturbing scene comes afterward when Lilya is seemingly pleased with this outcome. I can only imagine this is the result of a long tradition of women reducing themselves to gain stability in a relationship they rely on to survive. But even though Lilya makes this concession, it's not enough to keep peace in the household. Kolya's son, Roma, has decided Lilya is the source of their problems, and this criticism sits with her as she lays awake at night. At this point, it's easy to understand what Lilya is thinking. She's lived a difficult life her entire life, and she just had the opportunity to turn it all around. We don't know why she's not with Dmitri, but the two possibilities are either she chose not to be with him, or he rejected her. In either situation, it's understandable if Lilya feels an immense amount of regret. She either missed her chance for a better life or actively sabotaged the best thing in her life. Whatever semblance she had of contentment before, her life is now irrevocably worse. And although I am attempting to give insight into her motivations and explain where she's coming from, you can still do that and acknowledge Lilya's situation is her own fault. And when she's lying awake at night, she knows it's her fault. Given the abject misery of everyone's life in this world, that little loss of contentment might be enough to drive a person insane, or in this case, to suicide. I've decided to focus on Lilya because I think her character is unfairly criticized as uniquely immoral or uniquely flawed, but in reality, every character in this story has a glaring personality flaw, and to judge any of them too quickly is to judge them too harshly given their circumstance. And I believe this point is reinforced by the various references to the biblical story of Job. Look, I'll be honest and say I am by no means a religions expert, so my analysis of Leviathan's religious themes may be completely completely off the mark. But anyway, Lilya commits suicide by jumping off a cliff into freezing waters, and Kolya is informed of her death after they discover her body. Kolya is left in a catatonic state, since at this point he's pushed away his closest friend, and now his girlfriend is dead, on top of his property getting seized by the state, to which he has no allies to fight against anymore. Kolya falls into a deeper depression, and I really need to take a moment and give credit to the actor for Kolya, because his portrayal of that depression is really quite remarkable. The character is already a grumpy drunk the entire movie, but once we get to this point in his character, he is clearly more despondent in the latter part of the film. He looks completely disheveled and unhinged, even for a guy that seemingly wears the same clothes and drinks every day. And when Kolya goes to the market to fuel his alcoholism, the religious themes become more apparent. Kolya runs into his local priest, who he badgers for answers about his suffering. In response, the priest paraphrases the story of Job. If you're like me, you've probably never read the Bible, but maybe flipped through some of the more frequently referenced stories just for context. So in brief, the story of Job is about a man named Job who fears God and worships him. In the story, God is boasting about Job to Satan, but Satan claims Job only worships God because he's had a good life with a large family and prosperous property. Satan wagers to God if Job had lost those things, he would lose his faith in God. In the story, God agrees for Satan to test this theory, and Job experiences a series of misfortunes, such as losing all of his children, losing all of his property, and becoming inflicted with disease. A few other things happen in the story, but eventually Job confronts God about his series of misfortunes and asks why he's suffering. In response, God asks a series of rhetorical questions to convey that Job doesn't truly understand the nature of existence, so he shouldn't be so accusatory of a divine being like God. And this is the section of Job's story that the priest paraphrases to Kolya. He asks him, "Can you pull in Leviathan with a fishhook or tie down its tongue with a rope? Will it keep begging you for mercy?" Practically, what the priest is doing is he's asking if Kolya is capable of bringing a massive beast under control so convincingly it would ask him for mercy. This question seems nonsensical, but it's meant to illustrate that God has divine wisdom and ability, whereas the receiver of this question has no idea what they're talking about. While you can have an interesting philosophical debate about how our species derives meaning through suffering, I interpreted this theme in Leviathan as a criticism of the toxic narratives used to justify the dismal statism of former communist countries, specifically Russia. Russian culture, and I would say much of Slavic culture in the modern era, is full of detached irony to the misfortune of their people. There's actually a joke about Russian history that it can be summarized in 5 words, and then things got worse. This is emblematic of an attitude that has taken over an entire culture, seeding that life is nothing but suffering, and complaining about it is a sign of weakness or naivete. Perhaps on some level this attitude makes a person more resilient to misfortune, but in instances like the story in Leviathan, this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. The mythos about this struggle is so pervasive in the culture because it provides meaning to the abject misery people suffer every day. People can withstand a lot of pain and misfortune if they can understand why it's happening, even if that explanation is shallow, such as prescribing it to fate or God's will. And if we compare the events of Leviathan to the true story that it's based on, we can see how this narrative disempowers people completely. After Lilya commits suicide, Angela is concerned Kolya may have killed her, citing his violent reaction to the affair and some comments he made earlier about killing both her and Dmitri. Angela reports her concerns to the police, who investigate Lilya's death as a homicide. The police discover Lilya was sexually assaulted a dozen or so hours before her death, and she had marks of physical abuse, and we know both of these things are true because Kolya raped her and hit her after he found out about the affair. This is enough evidence for the police to arrest Kolya for her murder. When he's in custody, the police piece together their version of events, which implicates Kolya as Lilya's murderer. Now, remember, Kolya has a temper problem and has previously raged out against officers, the mayor, and his own friends. He is absolutely somebody that would be defiant in the face of injustice. He's the type of person that would make a killdozer and demolish 13 different properties. And he could easily explode on these officers and make his life so much worse. But this isn't America, this is Russia. With this in mind, there's something profound about how Kolya reacts to this false allegation. He breaks down into tears. He is resigned to what he believes is his fate. And the disturbing suggestion of the story is statist governments like post-communism Russia understand the power of self-defeating religious narratives and use them to maintain control. The reason these bureaucrats are comfortable torturing their subjects is they believe they have the divine power of God. We see this earlier in the film when Vadim is talking to a religious advisor who suggests God is divine because he is powerful, which could be misconstrued as having power makes you divine. In this context, Vadim is not only flexing his power for the sake of doing so, but to reinforce the righteous conviction of his rule, even if it's over some small shitty town. He does this because he believes it is God's will, and it's no surprise Vadim demolished Kolya's house to build an Orthodox church, although even this gesture is to impress elites in the political class. Vadim plays with Kolya's life the same way God plays with Job, and he believes it is everyone else's responsibility to respect his power, even if it is unlawful, abusive, or cruel. Or to put it another way, these Russian people should accept life as suffering, and complaining about it just shows you're weak or naive. The extent of the state's power is exemplified in the film when Kolya's house is demolished after he's been arrested. There's a good creative decision to shoot this destruction sequence from inside the house, so you truly get an understanding of the overwhelming power of the state as it destroys Kolya's family home. And unlike the story of Job, where Job is rewarded for keeping the faith with a new family and more property, we see Kolya sentenced to prison for 15 years, a development that pleases Vadim while he's out dining at an expensive restaurant. Throughout this movie, we see the imagery of a whale, perhaps the closest thing we have in the modern day to what the Bible refers to as a Leviathan. We see it in the opening montage, and we see it just before Lilya kills herself, but more importantly, we see the skeleton of a whale multiple times throughout this movie, including in the end montage of shots. And when I see this skeleton, I think about the question God asked Job: could you bring a Leviathan to your mercy? This question is meant to express only God could control such a beast. But in this town, with this defeatist culture and narrative as a result of corrupt governments that have existed in various forms for over a century, even a Leviathan can't survive. I really love this movie because its message is unique to its country of origin, and it is a relatively profound criticism of state-focused governments without any of that psycho boomer individualism that usually gets smuggled in with those stories. I will also say that, like any great piece of art, Leviathan doesn't focus on making a point, but rather shows a story that feels true. So what you get from this experience is based on your own experience, and my reading of it may be totally off base. But either way, I definitely recommend you check it out. It's free on YouTube. You can buy it there too if you want to, or on Amazon Prime. Just remember, this is the Russian film made in 2014, not the American film with the same name made in 2012. This movie has themes about politics and family problems, which may be on your mind as we get further from the election and closer to Thanksgiving, or potentially after Thanksgiving, depending on how long it took me to edit this. And as pessimistic as you may be about the current state of affairs, I think Leviathan embodies some sage advice that we should always keep in mind, which is things can never get so bad that they can't get worse. Hey, thanks for watching my review of the movie Leviathan. I would really appreciate it if you left a comment so I know a human being actually watched this video all the way to the end. And if you think I should spend more time making videos like this, there's no better way to express that than to support me on Patreon. I have a regular job. This is something I do for fun. But if you want to send me a message that says I should spend more of my time making videos like this, then there's no better way to do that than to support these videos at $3 or $4 a month. If you can't do that or can't afford to do that, totally fine. Like I said, I make these videos for fun. I make videos roughly once a month. If you'd like to see more videos like this, feel free to subscribe. But mostly I just hope you'll leave a comment so I know somebody watched it. Stay strong, Royals. Thanks so much.